Keisha Ward was a mother of two, a woman known to show up for her responsibilities, someone who moved through her days with quiet determination. When she was found dead, the shock wasn't just that her life had ended, but that it had ended after years of suffering that almost no one truly saw. What initially appeared to be a single moment of violence quickly revealed itself as the final chapter of a much longer story. Investigators would soon understand that this was not a case defined by one bad night or one sudden escalation. It was shaped by patterns that stretched back years, by fear that lived behind closed doors, and by resilience that carried Keisha forward even as the danger around her grew. To the outside world, her life looked functional, even stable. But beneath that surface was a reality marked by control, intimidation, and silence. Domestic abuse often doesn't announce itself. It hides in routines, in carefully managed appearances, and in the hope that enduring one more day might somehow make things safer for tomorrow. Keisha's story forces an uncomfortable reckoning with how easily suffering can go unnoticed, even by those who care deeply. It raises questions not just about what happened to her, but about how many opportunities there were to intervene before it was too late. As details began to emerge, family members were left grappling with painful hindsight. Moments that once seemed small or ambiguous took on new meaning. Missed calls, changes in behavior, attempts to help that were met with reassurance rather than alarm. None of it felt obvious at the time. Taken together, it painted a picture of a woman carrying far more than anyone realized. This documentary does not seek to sensationalize Keisha Ward's death. Instead, it follows the path that led there, with care and restraint, to understand how prolonged abuse can exist in plain sight. It centers on who Keisha was, the strength she showed every day, and the two daughters whose lives were forever altered by what was hidden from view. Because this is not just one story. It is a reflection of a system that too often reacts after violence becomes undeniable, rather than before it turns fatal. Before her name became associated with a criminal investigation, Keisha Ward was first and foremost a mother. She was raising two daughters, navigating the daily demands of work, parenting, and responsibility with a steadiness that those around her came to rely on. To friends, relatives, and co-workers, she appeared capable and composed, someone who handled what life placed in front of her without drawing attention to herself. Keisha was not someone who sought sympathy or asked for help easily. She valued privacy and carried a strong sense of independence, traits that had been shaped long before the abuse in her life became a constant presence. She was known for putting her children first, structuring her days around their needs, their routines, and their sense of security. Even when exhausted, she showed up, driven by a belief that consistency and care could protect them from instability. Those closest to her often described her as resilient, though at the time, that resilience was seen as a strength rather than a warning sign. She managed responsibilities quietly, rarely complaining, rarely revealing when things felt overwhelming. In hindsight, that same resilience would be understood as survival, a way of holding everything together while absorbing more than anyone should have to endure. Keisha's life did not outwardly reflect chaos. She maintained work, kept her household functioning, and remained present for her daughter's milestones and daily needs. There were no frequent emergency calls, no public confrontations, no obvious signs that suggested imminent danger. This outward normalcy became part of what allowed the abuse to remain hidden, not just from authorities, but from people who cared deeply about her. Family members later reflected on how carefully Keisha guarded her personal struggles. When asked how she was doing, she often reassured others that things were fine, even when they weren't. She downplayed concerns, redirected conversations, and maintained a sense of control over how much of her reality others could see. It wasn't deception as much as protection, both of herself and of the fragile stability she was trying to preserve for her children. Her identity was deeply tied to motherhood. Decisions were filtered through what she believed would keep her daughters safe, housed, and emotionally grounded. That responsibility weighed heavily, especially as fear became part of her private life. Yet even under that pressure, Keisha continued forward, making choices day by day that she believed were the least harmful in an impossible situation. As this story unfolds, it's important to remember that Keisha Ward was more than a victim of domestic abuse. She was a woman navigating limited options within a system that often requires victims to expose themselves to greater risk before meaningful protection is offered. Her silence was not weakness. It was shaped by fear, love for her children, and the hope that endurance might eventually lead to safety. If you're finding value in stories told with care and accountability, this is a moment to support the work being done here. Subscribing to Beyond the Evidence, liking this video, and turning on notifications helps ensure that stories like Keisha's are told with the depth and respect they deserve, and that conversations about prevention and accountability continue beyond a single case. Understanding who Keisha was before her death is essential, because it reframes everything that follows. Her story is not about sudden violence disrupting an otherwise untouched life. It is about a woman who lived with strength and restraint, carrying a hidden burden while trying to protect the people she loved most. Keisha Ward's relationships formed the framework of her daily life, shaping not only how she moved through the world, but how she concealed what was happening behind closed doors. To family members, she remained a dependable presence, someone who checked in, showed up when expected, and maintained familiar routines. Those connections gave the impression of stability, even as her private reality grew increasingly constrained. Within her immediate family, Keisha often took on the role of the steady one. She avoided burdening others with her problems, choosing instead to listen more than she spoke. Relatives would later say that she rarely asked for help outright, and when concerns were raised, she often responded with reassurance. At the time, this was interpreted as strength and self-sufficiency. Only later did it become clear that this pattern may have masked a deepening sense of isolation. Friendships followed a similar pattern. Keisha maintained contact, but boundaries around her personal life were firm. Conversations stayed focused on work, parenting, and everyday matters. When invitations were declined or plans changed at the last minute, explanations were brief and unremarkable. These subtle shifts did not stand out on their own, which is often how abuse remains hidden in social networks that lack clear warning signs. Her intimate relationship, however, carried a different weight. Over time, it became defined by imbalance rather than partnership. Control did not necessarily appear as constant conflict, but as gradual restriction, influencing where Keisha went, who she saw, and how freely she could communicate. These dynamics developed slowly, often framed in ways that made them seem temporary or manageable. What appeared on the surface as concern or involvement increasingly limited her autonomy. Power within the relationship did not rely solely on physical force. Emotional pressure, fear of escalation, and concern for her children played significant roles. Keisha's decisions were shaped by an ongoing calculation of risk, weighing each action against potential consequences. This constant vigilance was invisible to most people in her life, but it influenced everything from her social interactions to how much of herself she revealed. Family members later reflected on moments when something felt off, but not enough to intervene decisively. There were changes in her tone, moments of withdrawal, and a growing reluctance to discuss certain topics. When asked directly if she was safe, Keisha often deflected or minimized concerns. These responses created uncertainty rather than alarm, leaving loved ones unsure of how far to press or whether they were misreading the situation. The presence of her daughters further complicated these dynamics. Keisha's priority was protecting them from instability and harm, which influenced how she navigated both conflict and disclosure. Leaving, reporting abuse, or seeking outside help carried perceived risks that felt greater than staying silent. Her role as a mother became intertwined with her endurance, reinforcing a belief that maintaining control over the situation, however limited, was the safest option available. Abuse thrives in these kinds of relational spaces, where control is subtle, fear is normalized, and victims remain connected enough to appear supported, but isolated enough to remain vulnerable. Keisha was not cut off from the world, but she was constrained within it. Those around her saw pieces of her life, never the full picture, and that partial visibility made intervention difficult. Understanding these dynamics is critical to understanding what happened next. Keisha's relationships did not fail because of neglect or indifference. They existed within a context where information was limited, fear shaped behavior, and abuse adapted to remain hidden. The people who cared about her were operating with incomplete knowledge, and Keisha was making decisions under pressure that few could fully see. This section of the story is not about assigning blame to those around her. It is about recognizing how easily abuse can embed itself within ordinary relationships, exploiting trust, routine, and silence. Keisha's experience reflects a reality shared by many victims, where harm exists not in isolation, but woven quietly into the fabric of everyday life. For many victims of domestic abuse, there is no single, unmistakable moment that signals the beginning of danger. In Keisha Ward's life, the early warning signs appeared gradually, blending into the routines of everyday responsibility. What would later be recognized as indicators of harm initially presented as stress, fatigue, or the pressures of balancing work and motherhood. Family members recalled noticing small changes that were easy to explain away at the time. Keisha became more guarded in her conversations, offering fewer details about her personal life. She was still present, still engaged, but there was a noticeable shift in how much she shared. When asked directly if something was wrong, her responses were calm and reassuring, designed to close the conversation rather than invite concern. There were moments when communication became inconsistent. Missed calls went unreturned longer than usual. Messages were brief or delayed. Plans were canceled without explanation. None of these instances felt urgent on their own, and each could be rationalized. It was only later, when viewed together, that they formed a pattern suggesting increased control and monitoring within her intimate relationship. Keisha also appeared increasingly cautious about her movements. She limited spontaneous outings and became more predictable in her schedule. This kind of behavioral narrowing is common in abusive situations, where victims attempt to avoid conflict by reducing variables that could trigger confrontation. At the time, it looked like practicality or exhaustion. In reality, it reflected an environment where freedom carried consequences. There were attempts by family members to offer help, though often indirectly. Invitations to spend time together, offers of childcare assistance, and casual check-ins were extended. Keisha usually declined politely or shifted the conversation elsewhere. Her reluctance was not rooted in a lack of trust, but in fear. Accepting help could invite questions, and questions could destabilize a situation she was trying desperately to manage. Importantly, there were no formal reports of abuse during this period. No police calls. No protective orders. No documented complaints. This absence of records would later complicate the investigation, but it also highlights a common reality. Many victims avoid official systems until the risk feels unavoidable, often because previous experiences or perceived barriers suggest those systems may not offer immediate safety. Keisha's concern for her daughters heavily influenced her decisions. She weighed the potential consequences of disclosure against the immediate need to maintain housing, routine, and emotional stability for them. Fear of retaliation, disbelief, or escalation made silence feel like a protective strategy. Her choices were shaped not by denial of danger, but by a calculation of survival within limited options. From the outside, these warning signs remained ambiguous. Loved ones sensed tension but lacked confirmation. The absence of visible injuries or overt crises made it difficult to justify intervention beyond gentle support. This uncertainty often paralyzes bystanders, leaving them unsure whether pressing harder might cause harm rather than prevent it. Advocates later emphasized that early warning signs of abuse rarely align with dramatic expectations. They are often subtle, behavioral, and relational. Changes in communication, increasing isolation, and heightened vigilance are common indicators, but they are easily misinterpreted without context. Keisha's experience reflected this reality, where danger grew quietly, shielded by normalcy. In hindsight, family members would revisit these moments with painful clarity. What once seemed minor now felt urgent. Offers of help felt insufficient. Conversations felt incomplete. This retrospective understanding, while emotionally heavy, underscores how difficult it is to identify abuse while it is actively being concealed. The inciting phase of Keisha Ward's story is defined not by a single event, but by accumulation. Each small shift, each unspoken fear, contributed to a situation that became increasingly dangerous over time. These early warning signs did not fail because they were invisible. They failed because abuse is designed to exist just below the threshold of certainty. As time passed, the dynamics in Keisha Ward's life shifted from subtle control to a more persistent state of fear. What had once been managed through caution and restraint began to demand constant vigilance. The abuse did not erupt all at once. It tightened slowly, shaping her days and narrowing her sense of safety until living under threat became part of her normal routine. Keisha's world grew smaller. Decisions that once felt automatic now required calculation. Where she went, how long she stayed, who she spoke to, and what she shared were all filtered through an awareness of potential consequences. This kind of mental burden is difficult to see from the outside, but it consumes victims internally, creating exhaustion that no amount of rest can resolve. Despite this, Keisha continued fulfilling her responsibilities. She went to work, cared for her daughters, and maintained the outward appearance of stability. This endurance was not a sign that the situation was under control. It was evidence of how deeply she felt responsible for keeping life functioning, even as the conditions around her deteriorated. Survival, in this context, meant minimizing disruption rather than seeking escape. Control within the abusive relationship intensified. Isolation became more pronounced, not through outright prohibition, but through pressure and consequence. Keisha limited her interactions, avoided topics that could provoke tension, and adapted her behavior to maintain a fragile sense of peace. Over time, this adaptation became ingrained, making it harder to imagine alternatives that did not involve risk. Fear played a central role in maintaining this cycle. Fear of retaliation, fear of escalation, fear that involving authorities or outside systems might make things worse rather than better. For Keisha, these fears were not abstract. They were grounded in lived experience and reinforced by the unpredictability of her situation. Each day required balancing immediate safety against long-term uncertainty. Her daughters remained at the center of every decision. Keisha believed that as long as she could shield them from direct harm, enduring the abuse herself was a form of protection. This belief, while heartbreaking, is common among survivors who prioritize their children's stability over their own safety. Leaving or reporting felt like it could expose her daughters to greater danger or upheaval. Family members noticed increased stress, though its source remained unclear. Keisha appeared more tired, more reserved. She deflected concern with practical explanations, framing her exhaustion as the result of work and parenting demands. Without concrete evidence, loved ones struggled to know how to intervene without overstepping or causing harm. Advocates explain that escalation often occurs alongside increased secrecy. Victims become skilled at managing appearances, anticipating conflict, and de-escalating situations before they spiral. These strategies can be effective in the short term, but they also mask the severity of the danger. Keisha's ability to keep going, to adapt, and to endure may have unintentionally obscured how unsafe her life had become. The absence of formal intervention during this period was not due to indifference. It was a result of a system that often requires visible crisis before action is taken. Without reports, documentation, or direct disclosure, opportunities for prevention were limited. Keisha was navigating this reality alone, carrying the weight of decisions that no one should have to make in isolation. Living under threat reshapes a person's sense of self. Confidence erodes. Options feel narrower. Hope becomes conditional. Yet even within this environment, Keisha demonstrated resilience. She continued planning for her daughters' futures, maintaining routines, and finding moments of normalcy where she could. These acts were not denial. They were resistance, small assertions of agency in a life increasingly defined by control. This period of escalation is critical to understanding what followed. The danger was not sudden or unpredictable. It grew over time, reinforced by fear, secrecy, and systemic gaps. By the time the situation reached its breaking point, the groundwork had long been laid, and Keisha was living in a state where safety felt temporary and fragile. The death of Keisha Ward did not occur in isolation from what came before. It was a tragic culmination of years marked by control, fear, and unaddressed violence. When authorities were alerted and arrived at the scene, they were confronted with the reality that a woman who had quietly endured so much had lost her life. Details surrounding the circumstances of Keisha's death were handled with care by investigators, and they remain described in factual, limited terms. What is known is that her death was the result of domestic violence, not a random or spontaneous act. It reflected an escalation that advocates recognize as common when abuse intensifies without intervention. There were no public warnings or dramatic confrontations leading up to that moment. In many cases like this, violence escalates behind closed doors, unnoticed until the consequences are irreversible. Keisha's case followed that pattern. The absence of prior reports or visible crises did not mean danger was absent. It meant it had been hidden. First responders approached the situation with the understanding that they were entering not just a crime scene, but the aftermath of prolonged trauma. The focus was immediate, procedural, and respectful. Keisha was identified as a mother of two, a detail that immediately shaped the response and underscored the gravity of what had occurred. Investigators began working to establish a timeline, relying on physical evidence, known patterns of behavior, and contextual information gathered from those who knew Keisha. Early assessments made clear that this was not an incident that could be understood by examining a single day or event. It required looking backward, into the months and years that preceded it. The impact of the crime extended beyond the loss of life. 2 children were left without their mother. A family was confronted with questions that would never have fully satisfying answers. For those who had sensed something was wrong but lacked certainty, the realization was devastating. The silence that once felt protective now felt catastrophic. Importantly, this section of the story resists the urge to focus on sensational details. Keisha's death is not defined by how it happened, but by the conditions that made it possible. Graphic descriptions do not honor victims, and speculation does not bring understanding. What matters is acknowledging that this outcome was preventable and that its roots were long established. Domestic violence fatalities often prompt a search for a singular failure, a moment where intervention could have changed everything. In reality, they are the result of layered vulnerabilities and systemic gaps. Keisha's death exposed those gaps in the most irreversible way. As the immediate response transitioned into a full investigation, the focus began to shift. The question was no longer only what had happened, but how a woman living under threat had gone so long without effective protection. Her death became a point of reckoning for those tasked with uncovering the truth. This moment marks the emotional center of the story. It is where endurance gives way to loss, and where the cost of silence becomes undeniable. From here, the narrative moves outward, examining the shockwaves that followed and the people left to carry the weight of what could not be undone. In the hours and days following Keisha Ward's death, her absence became the most overwhelming reality for those who loved her. Family members struggled to process how someone so central to their lives could be gone so suddenly, especially under circumstances that felt both shocking and painfully close. Grief arrived alongside confusion, disbelief, and an urgent need to understand what had happened. For her family, the loss was not abstract. It was immediate and deeply personal. Keisha had been a constant presence, someone others relied on, and her sudden absence left a void that could not be easily filled. Everyday routines became reminders of what was missing, and familiar spaces felt altered by her absence. Her daughters became the focus of immediate concern. The question of how to protect them, support them, and help them understand a loss that even adults struggled to comprehend weighed heavily on those around them. The responsibility Keisha had carried alone now shifted to a network of relatives and caregivers, all navigating grief while trying to provide stability. As news of her death spread, the broader community responded with shock. To many, Keisha's life had appeared ordinary, even unremarkable in the sense that nothing suggested imminent danger. This disconnect between appearance and reality prompted difficult conversations about how abuse can remain invisible, even within close-knit environments. Family members began revisiting past interactions, searching for moments that might have signaled deeper trouble. These reflections were not driven by blame, but by a need to make sense of the loss. Regret surfaced in quiet ways, through questions about whether different choices or stronger intervention could have changed the outcome. These thoughts, though natural, offered no comfort. Support poured in through messages, visits, and shared memories. People spoke of Keisha's dedication to her children, her reliability, and her quiet strength. These remembrances served as both solace and sorrow, reinforcing how much she had meant to others while highlighting the permanence of her absence. At the same time, the reality of domestic violence began to take clearer shape for those around her. What had once felt distant or theoretical became painfully real. Keisha's death forced a confrontation with the idea that abuse does not always announce itself, and that its consequences can be swift and final. Community advocates and support organizations recognized the significance of the case early on. While respecting the family's privacy, they began discussing how Keisha's story reflected broader systemic challenges. Her death was not an isolated tragedy, but part of a pattern that too often ends the same way when warning signs go unaddressed. The emotional weight of the aftermath settled heavily over everyone involved. There was mourning for Keisha herself, for the future she would never have, and for the daughters she left behind. There was also an emerging sense that her death could not be allowed to pass without reflection or change. As the immediate shock began to subside, attention slowly turned toward the investigation. Grief did not pause for process, but the need for answers became unavoidable. The story moved from mourning to examination, from loss to accountability, setting the stage for the deeper inquiry that followed. As the initial shock of Keisha Ward's death gave way to the demands of process, investigators began the difficult task of reconstructing a life that had been carefully guarded. From the outset, it was clear that understanding what happened would require more than examining a single event. Detectives recognized that this was likely the outcome of prolonged domestic abuse, and that the truth would be found in patterns rather than isolated facts. Law enforcement worked closely with domestic violence advocates, a collaboration that proved essential. Advocates helped contextualize behaviors that might otherwise have been misinterpreted or overlooked. They provided insight into how fear, control, and secrecy shape victims' actions, helping investigators interpret gaps in reporting and documentation not as absences of harm, but as indicators of it. The investigation relied heavily on interviews with family members, friends, and co-workers. Each conversation added a piece to the larger picture. Individually, these accounts described a woman who was reliable, private, and deeply devoted to her children. Collectively, they revealed subtle but consistent signs of restriction, stress, and emotional strain that had gone largely unrecognized. Detectives examined timelines, communication records, and known movements, searching for indicators of escalation. While there were no formal complaints or protective orders on file, investigators identified behavioral markers consistent with coercive control. Missed opportunities for intervention became apparent, not through negligence, but through the limitations of systems that depend on victims to initiate action. One of the most significant revelations was how effectively the abuse had been concealed. Keisha had maintained employment, parenting responsibilities, and social connections, all while living under threat. This outward stability complicated both the investigation and public understanding of the case. It challenged assumptions about what victims of domestic violence look like and how danger presents itself. Advocates emphasized that Keisha's experience was not unusual. Many victims avoid formal systems due to fear of retaliation, lack of trust, or concern for their children's safety. In this case, the absence of reports became a critical learning point rather than a reason for doubt. Investigators began to frame the case as an example of systemic vulnerability rather than individual failure. As evidence was gathered, a clearer picture of control and escalation emerged. Investigators identified patterns that aligned with known cycles of abuse, including increasing isolation and psychological pressure. These findings reinforced the understanding that Keisha's death was not unpredictable, but the foreseeable result of unchecked violence. The investigation also prompted internal reviews within agencies involved. Questions were raised about how cases are identified, how risk is assessed, and how collaboration with advocacy organizations can be strengthened. Keisha's case highlighted the need for proactive measures that do not rely solely on victim disclosure. Public awareness grew as details of the investigation became known. Community members began engaging more openly in conversations about domestic violence, prevention, and support. While the family's grief remained private, the broader implications of the case began to resonate widely. Importantly, investigators remained focused on accountability. Establishing responsibility was essential, but so was understanding the context that allowed the abuse to continue. The case was not treated as a simple narrative of crime and punishment, but as a complex examination of how systems respond to hidden harm. By the time major findings were presented, Keisha Ward's story had shifted from a single tragic event to a case study in prevention failure. The investigation revealed not only what happened to her, but why it was able to happen at all. These revelations set the stage for legal outcomes and broader consequences that would follow. The legal consequences following Keisha Ward's death unfolded alongside a broader reckoning about responsibility and prevention. While the justice system moved forward with its procedures, the case had already begun to influence conversations that extended beyond the courtroom. Accountability, in this context, was not limited to a single individual, but expanded to include the structures meant to protect vulnerable people. As legal processes progressed, the focus remained factual and restrained. Authorities emphasized evidence, established patterns of abuse, and the sequence of events that led to Keisha's death. The case reinforced how domestic violence cases are often built not on one defining incident, but on cumulative behavior that only becomes visible after irreversible harm has occurred. For Keisha's family, legal accountability offered limited comfort. No outcome could restore what had been lost, and no decision could answer every question that lingered. Still, the acknowledgement that her death was the result of prolonged abuse mattered. It validated the reality she had lived with and the fears she had quietly carried. Beyond the individual case, agencies involved began reviewing their practices. Discussions centered on how risk is assessed, how warning signs are interpreted, and how collaboration with advocacy organizations could be improved. Keisha's case exposed gaps that are common across jurisdictions, particularly when victims do not or cannot formally report abuse. Advocates used the case to highlight the importance of early intervention and survivor-centered approaches. They emphasize that systems must adapt to recognize patterns of control and fear, not just physical injury or crisis calls. The goal was not to assign blame retroactively, but to prevent future tragedies by addressing known vulnerabilities. Policy discussions followed, focusing on training, information sharing, and resource allocation. While change is often slow, Keisha's story became a reference point in these conversations. Her case illustrated the cost of inaction and the need for proactive measures that do not rely solely on victims to initiate protection. Public response also played a role. Awareness campaigns, community forums, and educational efforts began referencing the case as an example of how domestic abuse can remain hidden until it is too late. These efforts aim to shift perceptions, encouraging people to recognize subtle warning signs and to approach concerns with seriousness and care. Importantly, the consequences extended to how victims are viewed. Keisha's experience challenged stereotypes about who is at risk and what danger looks like. It underscored that resilience and outward stability do not equate to safety. This shift in understanding became one of the most lasting impacts of the case. Accountability, in its fullest sense, meant acknowledging that systems failed to reach Keisha before the violence escalated beyond control. It also meant committing to learning from that failure. Her death became a catalyst for reflection, urging institutions and communities alike to consider how protection can be offered earlier and more effectively. As the immediate legal and policy responses settled, attention began to turn toward legacy. The question was no longer only what went wrong, but what could be done differently moving forward. This transition set the stage for reflecting on Keisha Ward's life, her strength, and the meaning her story would carry beyond the tragedy itself. Keisha Ward's story does not end with the conclusions of an investigation or the outcomes of legal proceedings. Its true weight lives on in the lives she shaped, especially in the daughters she left behind. They are the living continuation of her strength, carrying forward the love and care she worked so hard to provide, even under circumstances marked by fear and constraint. Throughout her life, Keisha made choices with protection in mind. Every compromise, every moment of endurance, was rooted in a desire to keep her children safe and stable. That context matters when her story is remembered. She was not defined by silence, but by the difficult calculations she was forced to make in a system that too often places the burden of safety on those already at risk. Her case has become a reference point for conversations about domestic violence prevention and survivor support. Not because her experience was unique, but because it reflects a reality shared by many who live with abuse that never reaches official records. Keisha's life and death underscore the need to look beyond obvious crises and to recognize the quieter signs of danger. For her family, legacy is personal and ongoing. It lives in memories, in stories shared, and in the responsibility of raising her daughters with the same care Keisha showed every day. Grief remains, but so does determination. The focus is not only on loss, but on honoring who she was and what she valued. Keisha's story also leaves a broader responsibility with the community. It asks difficult questions about awareness, intervention, and belief. It challenges assumptions about who needs help and when that help should be offered. Most importantly, it reminds us that noticing is not enough if it does not lead to action. Domestic abuse thrives in silence and uncertainty. Breaking that silence requires systems that respond early, communities that take concerns seriously, and support networks that do not wait for proof of crisis before offering protection. Keisha's case illustrates what is at stake when those elements fail to align. As this story comes to a close, the focus returns to the purpose of telling it. This documentary is not about fear, but about responsibility. It is about understanding how strength and vulnerability can coexist, and how resilience should not be mistaken for safety. Keisha Ward's life deserves to be remembered for more than how it ended. For those watching, her story invites reflection. It asks viewers to consider how they respond to subtle signs of distress, how they support those who may be living with fear, and how systems can be pushed to do better. Awareness is only meaningful when it leads to change. Keisha's legacy is not only a warning. It is a call to protect, to listen, and to act before silence becomes irreversible. Remembering her means committing to a world where fewer stories end the same way.